Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and events have been moving extremely quickly. What I want to talk about in this video is about what the ERG have been up to, and for the longest time today I thought it was essentially just one thing. Some of this I started noting down last night, but then in snatches and little breaks at work when I was catching up, the most remarkable thing has happened, so I'm going to have to talk about that at the end. But first of all, let's just quickly recap what happened last night. I was watching with interest and incredulity, quite frankly, the proceedings in the Commons last night as the Prime Minister ordered her own MPs to vote against her own motion, and half of her cabinet defied that order. Turns out one resigned over it. It seems she did a bit of a deal, and the cabinet ministers who wanted to vote in favour of it, she said, well, I'll tell you what, if you abstain, I won't sack you. So most of them abstained. But one absolutely wanted to vote for it. They've resigned. Technically, the others should too, because but that was the deal apparently. So I listened to various other points of order and debates after the votes, and carried on doing so for a while after the Prime Minister left the chamber. And then I thought it was safe to recount the events of the day. But no sooner had I uploaded that video then the shocking news came out that Theresa May was indeed going to put her withdrawal agreement up for a vote again. Now, there were hints throughout the day of that. Earlier in the day, the Chancellor of the Exchequer in his budget said if Parliament votes for the deal, then he will provide a dividend of £29 billion. And I was thinking to myself at the time, I don't think he really understands how bribes work. You're doing this a day after the vote where Parliament said they're not going to support it. But of course, there was always going to be a third one, I suppose. I mean, that's what's happened. Then someone forwarded a tweet to me that the ERG was saying that they would vote through the deal on the third time, but with varying conditions. They did that before, laying out impossible conditions, quite illegal conditions, in fact, just so they had an excuse not to vote for it. This could be nothing more. So forgive me for being a bit cynical here. I'm not sure that they're being totally honest about it. But then these are the conditions. So some are saying that the condition is that Theresa May resigns after it goes through. Another condition is that she calls for a general election. So it doesn't even sound like they're speaking with one voice yet, though I'm quite sure they will at some point, and we all know whose voice that will be. But is this why Theresa May is going to put up her deal for another vote, or was she going to do it anyway? Either are plausible. Now, I've had an increasing number of comments about game theory as we built up to this Brexit endgame, but I think now is really the time to use it. What does Theresa May want? What does the ERG want? Now, I'll be honest, I don't absolutely know what Theresa May wants. She's a Remainer. She knows how damaging any form of Brexit is, but especially a no-deal Brexit. As such, I can't really believe that she wants her deal to go through, even though there are other possibilities. However, I also know that her precious party is more important to her than anything, even the future of the well-being of the nation. So if she had to do something to move against her pro-EU leaning tendencies, she would do for the sake of the party. The ERG are more transparent. They want a complete break from the EU. They say they want that. They do want that. They know that access to the single market means accepting EU rules. They don't want that, and so don't want access to the single market. If they vote for Theresa May's deal, then they know that at least part of the UK is going to be permanently locked into a customs union, for example, with the EU, unless and until Ireland reunifies. But then people say, well, that'll happen and then that'll solve the problem. That doesn't solve the problem. Outside of an EU customs union and with no access to the single market, which is what the ERG want, people will soon see how terrible that would be. That means that the actual trade agreement that would take some years to agree anyway will eventually have to move itself towards exactly that, customs union, single access to the single market, all the things that ERG don't want. Besides, even in the interim, during the transition period, which is what comes with this deal, we'll still have to follow EU rules in that period, and that includes the new rules on tax avoidance, and it also, ironically, will include the old rules on tax avoidance that we have been ignoring. Remember, the EU is protectionist. It is that. Let's not make no bones about that, whether you agree that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether you approve of it or not. That's what they are. So the new EU rules will favour their members and not non-members. With the UK no longer having a say expect rules that the UK government would not approve of to suddenly come into force. And unlike now, where we're powerful enough, influential enough to ignore the ones we don't like, or up to a point, we are actually taking the piss recently, and I think the EU is planning on taking us to court anyway, we will have to actually agree to obey them outside of the EU, or we get kicked out of the club. Like at the moment, the EU can't kick us out of the club. We have to elect to leave. I don't think there's any provision for removing a member. You can take them to court if they're not obviously fulfilling their obligations, same as any two countries can, if there's an agreement not being fulfilled. But, well, they'd be allowed to kick us out of the club. Or at the very least, taken to court for a breach of our agreement. They could easily do that. We've got no influence to stop that. So one way or another, Theresa May's withdrawal agreement is a route towards remaining with EU rules. That's why they oppose it. So why say they'll vote for it now? Potentially, is it because they believe that if they don't, Brexit won't happen at all? I still think no deal Brexit is the most likely outcome. I do not believe that a no Brexit is likely. It's possible, it's just not likely. But they may believe that it is, or at least it's too large a risk. But I don't see that as motivation. After all, this form of Brexit, the deal, doesn't actually move us out of the EU. We give up influence, but we don't gain the so-called independence that they keep going on about. So no Brexit isn't actually worse than this form of Brexit for them. It could be argued that no Brexit actually serves them better, because then they can whip up hatred for Parliament by saying, oh, politicians, they've defied the will of the people. Don't expect that just because, if that ever did happen, we'd have had to have a second referendum where the result would have been a majority remain. Don't expect that to change their tune. Come what may, there are still a lot of people in this country that have been conditioned to resent the EU, to blame it for all our ills. No amount of argument will break that brainwashing. Only the cold, hard realities of a no-deal Brexit can do that, and that is what the sensible people are trying to avoid. Actually, another thing that could change their mind, I suppose, would be a government that commits to sharing the wealth of the nation with the wider population, not ministers' rich mates. I mean, let's face facts, the vast majority of people who want a complete break from the EU fall into one of two camps. They're either super rich or they're super poor. And the super poor, of course, feel disenfranchised. And rather than blame the government, which is where the blame actually lies, they mostly like to blame the EU because that's what newspapers have told them to do. So, and I wouldn't pin your hopes on Corbyn either. Even if he becomes Prime Minister, he has although distribution of wealth will of course be better for the time he's in Parliament, he's no interest in highlighting the benefits of the EU to the people. And of course, whatever he puts in place, as soon as the Tories get back in, they'll just reverse it in a day. It would actually take him some time to build up, because he's got to change quite a lot of Britain along socialist lines, which I would support most of. But it takes no time at all for the Tories to come in and change it in a day. So the ERG basically have a ready-made army of discontented citizens should we avoid Brexit altogether. The soft Brexit that will basically inevitably comes with a deal means that we will have left the EU just as they not only argued for, but they will have also voted for, but we won't get any benefits from it. And they'll have to start paying more tax, the ERG that is. How on earth does that do them any favours at all? Border status will remain the same. Immigrator status remains the same. Taxation rules will become actually harsher. Although we might still actually get our blue passports. Although I'm not quite sure how introspective xenophobes really need passports. But maybe it's to travel to Scotland for their grouse shooting when it becomes independent. But let's say May gives in to their demands, which isn't impossible but does seem rather unlikely. Don't they risk the rest of the Conservative Party out of sheer indignation supporting pro-EU candidates for leader? Don't forget the Brexiteers, although they are a substantial part of the parliamentary party, they are by no means in a large enough numbers to be able to make sure that a hardline Brexiteer becomes their next leader. Quite the reverse. At least May pretended to be a Brexiteer. She's certainly acted out that role. The next leader may be openly hostile to the Eurosceptics, which will have done quite a lot to damage both the country and the party. But I don't know how likely that is. That's just speculation. What I do know is that the ERG do vote If they do vote for the deal now, basically, they'll be voting for a deal that they have said is truly dreadful and worse than no deal. So how are they going to explain this to their followers? This is the sequence from the ERG point of view. 1. Theresa May's deal is bad. 2. No deal Brexit isn't actually a bad outcome and definitely better than the deal available. 3. If May's deal is defeated, then the default position is no deal. That is what they've told their followers. So for them to now vote for May's deal, to go back on what they've previously said, surely that'll get some of those followers to no longer regard them as truthful. I'm sure some will make excuses for their behaviour, just like people do for Corbyn going back on his word for supporting the people's vote, but they would have verifiably gone back on what they said. Now, I'm not 100% convinced, but I don't see them voting for it. But I do see a reason why they might say they would vote for it. They agree to vote for it. That doesn't quite mean enough numbers to pass it, by the way. But Theresa may feel that a few opposition MPs might crack at the last moment if there's no time for anything else, her deal or no deal. It wouldn't take that many opposition MPs. If all the Conservatives voted for it, obviously the DUP wouldn't. We already know 7 on the opposition bench has voted for it as well. She only needs a few more. 3 more will do it. So May moves her motion, confident that it will get just about enough support. It will break the DUP alliance, of course, but her government is broken anyway. Her main priority, remember, is that her party doesn't break. Then the ERG vote against it. There's no time to do anything else, and we crash out with no deal. Now, I'm not saying I believe this chain of events, but I can believe that the ERG might. All right? They know that Parliament will not deliberately go out with no deal, so they have to force them to do it accidentally. This involves wasting time right up until the end, getting them to believe that there's a way to avoid no deal right up until the end, and then pulling the rug from out their feet. Now, personally, I think that there'd still be time for a lengthy delay and another referendum. I think the ERG are not going to be able to engineer a no-deal Brexit, at least not without the compliance of the rest of Parliament, but the actions of MPs and others throughout this process have been one of arrogance beyond all reason. It makes it very difficult to predict, and this is the problem I have when trying to apply game theory to it. Now, at this moment, no date has been set for the vote other than it will be in 1 week. Finally, and this is the really super serious situation, the nuclear option for the ERG remains. I talked about this a little while ago. And I keep saying this, the ERG are not really Conservatives. Even Conservatives say they're not Conservatives. They're like UKIP members who saw that there's no power in UKIP, but joining the Conservatives, where Euroscepticism, even very hardline Euroscepticism, does have a home, is a route to power. But they do not give a crap about the party. They don't care about the party one iota. Whenever I say this, you always get someone in the comments going, oh, yes, they do, they do. No, they don't. And they've proved it again today. Their nuclear option is supporting the opposition in a vote of no confidence in the government. In other words, they can go to Jeremy Corbyn and say, I say, old chap, I hear you want a general election. Well, if you put another vote of no confidence motion, we'll support it. They will actually assassinate their own party in government just to get what they want. Just to get what they want. Because they don't have the numbers to democratically get what they want. Bear this in mind as well. Jeremy Corbyn wants both Brexit and a general election. There'll be no umming and ahhing about this. So as much as he hates working with even moderate Conservatives, or even MPs in his own party that are not exactly where he is on the political spectrum, the irony is that he could easily enter this Faustian pact with the extreme right wing. And I wonder how his supporters would view that. I'm sure many will rationalise it in their own minds. So what has actually happened? Now, Sir Christopher Chope has just basically said something in Parliament. Now, I just want to go through the authority that has been stripped away from the Prime Minister. But at the same time, she's not exactly stood up and dragged that authority back into herself. She has been the meekest Prime Minister I can imagine. I didn't think David Cameron was very strong, but my goodness. These are the sort of things that are a challenge to a Prime Minister's leadership. On the lowest level, you get a couple of backbenchers that defy the leadership. That happens. You know, they vote against their own government. That does happen. On another level, you get a group of backbenchers rebelling. Now, that's a bit more worrying. That's more newsworthy. The next level up, a minister resigns over an issue. That's more serious. That's definitely headline news. But again, it happens. Above that is when a government motion is actually defeated. This is much less common, but again, does happen. Then a motion is defeated by a large margin. Now, this is rare. This is super rare, and it has already happened multiple times with this government. They've been defeated multiple times by hefty margins. Then, when a government motion is voted again by ministers, rather than resign, they challenge the Prime Minister to sack them. That's a super serious challenge to a Prime Minister's authority. All of these things have happened under Theresa May's leadership. All of them. And then, above all that, all those levels of challenge, there is an MP on the government side of the House standing up with the television cameras on them, full public glare in front of the entire House of Commons. This is a Conservative MP standing up and telling the Prime Minister that they should go, and if they don't, that they will support the opposition in assassinating their own government. That is the parliamentary equivalent of DEFCON 1, and that is exactly what has happened. This fella, Sir Christopher Chope, who is a hardline Brexiteer, should come as no surprise, has basically, is not just threatened to do this in mutterings to a journalist. He's not just muttering discontent in an area where there are journalists. No, he's stood up in the House of Commons and publicly stated this. Jacob Rees-Mogg, remember, before Christmas, stood up and publicly stated that he would challenge her leadership of the Conservative Party. That was bad enough, I would have said, in terms of parliamentary behaviour and behaviour towards your, loyalty to your own party. To actually stand up and say that you are going to side with the opposition to kill off your own government, your own party in government, because you're not getting your own way. That, I cannot think of a greater example of party disloyalty than that. And do not imagine that this MP has stood up and said that off their own bat. They will have discussed, because this is super serious. You don't just, these things don't happen. You don't do this. This will be something they will have discussed with their colleagues, their hardline Brexiteer colleagues. Theresa May has no authority anymore. That's clear. That much is obvious. She allowed Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary to oppose her without sacking him. She's suffered monumental historic defeats. She's allowed ministers not to follow her three-line whip, including one of the people who didn't obey the three-line whip yesterday was themselves a whip. A whip didn't even follow their own instructions yesterday. That's how serious that was, and they still have the whip. They have no authority as a whip anymore. It's ridiculous. And now she's got members of her own party telling her, go, or I am going to bring down this government. Absolutely remarkable. And through all of this, she has never once stood up and told them to sit down and shut up, which is what any strong leader would have done. And plenty of strong leaders in the past, not in the distant past, in my lifetime, have done. Even John Major, and you won't believe this as him, apparently banged his fist on the table and called his cabinet a load of bastards. He came across as meek as you like. But even he had some steel. Theresa May has none of it. We have got two leaders of the largest parties in Parliament, neither of whom have got the backbone to actually deal with what is a constitutional crisis, what is the most difficult course to navigate for this country for centuries. Potentially even trickier than with the Second World War. That was possibly not less serious, but at least what we had to do was much clearer, and there was much greater agreement on it as well. So I just see it as Parliament has completely and utterly lost control. I do not see it regaining control because the time to have done so has already passed. We'll see what happens in the votes tonight. I am going to do another video tonight where I sum up the events of tonight's proceedings. But, I mean, the ERG look like they are in pole position. And although it's impossible to get what they want without Parliament complying with it, I don't see Parliament stopping them. Theresa May is certainly not stopping them. But we'll see for tonight anyway. Hope you found this video interesting at any rate. If you did, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content. Until next time, I'll see you later.